what would you say about the state of journalism, just on that topic today? Are we in a temporary kind of uh, are we experiencing a temporary problem in terms of the incentives, in terms of the business model, all that kind of stuff, or is this like a decline of traditional journalism as we know it?
You have to always think about the counterfactual in these things, which is like, okay, because these questions, right, this question heads towards, it's like, okay, the impact of social media and the undermining of truth and all this. But then you want to ask the question of like, okay, what if we had the modern media environment, including cable news and including social media and Twitter and everything else in 1939 or 1941, right, or 1910 or 1865 or 1850 or 1776, right? And like, I think
you just introduced like 5 thought experiments at once and broke my head. But yes. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting years in
Kennedy. I just take a simple example. Kennedy, like, how would President Kennedy have been interpreted with what we know now about all the things Kennedy was up to? Like, how would he have been experienced by the body politic with a social media context? Right? Like, how would LBJ have been experienced? By the way, how would, like many FDR, like the New Deal, the Great Depression.
I wonder where Twitter would think about Churchill and Hitler and Stalin.
I mean, look, to this day, there are lots of very interesting real questions around like how America, got, basically involved in World War II and who did what when, and the operations of British intelligence on American soil, and did FDR this, that, Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson ran for, his candidacy was run on an anti-war. He ran on the platform of not getting involved in World War I. Somehow that switched, like. And I'm not even making a value judgment on any of these things. I'm just saying, like, the way that our ancestors experienced reality was, of course, mediated through centralized top-down, right, control at that point. If you ran those realities again with the media environment we have today, the reality would be experienced very, very differently. And then, of course, that intermediation would cause the feedback loops to change, and then reality would obviously play out.
You think it'd be very different?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be, just because it's all so. I mean, just look at what's happening today. I mean, the most obvious thing is just the collapse. And here's another opportunity to argue that this is not the internet causing this, by the way. Here's a big thing happening today, which is Gallup does this thing every year where they poll for trust in institutions in America, and they do it across all the different, everything from the military to the clergy and big business and the media and so forth, right? And basically, there's been a systemic collapse in trust in institutions in the U.S., almost without exception, basically since essentially the early 1970s. There's 2 ways of looking at that, which is, oh my God, we've lost this old world in which we could trust institutions, and that was so much better because like that should be the way the world runs. The other way of looking at it is we just know a lot more now, and the great mystery is why those numbers aren't all 0.
Yeah.
Right? Because like now we know so much about how these things operate, and like they're not that impressive.
And also, why do we don't have better institutions and better leaders then?
Yeah, and so this goes to the thing, which is like, okay, had we had the media environment of that we've had between the 1970s and today, if we had that in the 30s and 40s or 1900s, 1910s, I think there's no question reality would turn out different, if only because everybody would have known to not trust the institutions, which would have changed their level of credibility, their ability to control circumstances. Therefore, the circumstances would have had to change. Right, and it would have been a feedback loop. Would have been a feedback loop process. In other words, right? It's your experience of reality changes reality, and then reality changes your experience of reality. Right? It's a 2-way feedback process, and media is the intermediating force between that. And so change the media environment, change reality.
Yeah.
And so it's just as a consequence, I think it's just really hard to say, oh, things worked a certain way then and they work a different way now, and then therefore like people were smarter then or better then, or by the way, dumber then or not as capable then. Right. We make all these like really light and casual like comparisons of ourselves to, previous generations of people. We draw judgments all the time. And I just think it's like really hard to do any of that, because if we put ourselves in their shoes with the media that they had at that time, like I think we probably most likely would have been just like them.
So don't you think that our perception and understanding of reality would be more and more mediated through large language models now?
Yeah.
So you said media before. Isn't the LLM going to be the new, mainstream media, MSM? It'll be LLM.
Yes.
That would be the source of, I'm sure there's a way to kind of rapidly fine tune, like making LLMs real time. I'm sure there's probably a research problem that you can do just rapid fine tuning to the new events, so something like this.
Well, even just the whole concept of the chat UI might not be the chat UI is just the first whack at this, and maybe that's the dominant thing. But look, maybe we don't know yet. Like maybe the experience most people have with LLMs is just a continuous feed. Maybe it's more of a passive feed, and you just are getting a constant like running commentary on everything happening in your life, and it's just helping you kind of interpret and understand everything.
Also, really more deeply integrated into your life, not just like like intellectual philosophical thoughts, but like literally like how to make a coffee, where to go for lunch, just whether to, how dating, all this kind of
What
stuff.
to say in a job interview? Yeah.
What to say?
Yeah, exactly.
What to say next sentence?
Yeah, next sentence. Yeah, at that level. Yeah, I mean, yes. So technically, now whether we want that or not is an open question, right? And whether
Boy, I
people
would
use
kill
that.
for a pop up, right now. The estimated engagement is decreasing. For Marc Andreessen's, there's a controversy section for his Wikipedia page in 1993. Something happened or something like this. Bring it up. That will drive engagement up. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, this gets this whole thing of like, so, the chat interface has this whole concept of prompt engineering, right? So
yes.
you have prompts. Well, it turns out one of the things that LLMs are really good at is writing prompts. Right.
Yeah.
And so like, what if you just outsourced? And by the way, you could run this experiment today. You could hook this up to do this today. The latency is not good enough to do it real time in a conversation, but you could run this experiment and you just say, look, every 20 seconds, you could just say, tell me what the optimal prompt is, and then ask yourself that question to give me the result.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you exactly to your point, as you add, there will be these systems are going to have the ability to be learned and updated essentially in real time. And so you'll be able to have a pendant or your phone or whatever, watch or whatever. It'll have a microphone on it. It'll listen to your conversations. It'll have a feed of everything else happening in the world, and then it'll be sort of retraining, prompting or retraining itself on the fly. And so the scenario you described is actually a completely doable scenario. Now, the hard question on these is always, okay, since that's possible, are people going to want that? Like, what's the form of experience?
Mm-hmm.
That we won't know until we try it. But I don't think it's possible yet to predict the form of AI in our lives. Therefore, it's not possible to predict the way in which it will intermediate our experience with reality yet.
Yeah, but it feels like there's going to be a killer app. There's probably a mad scramble right now inside OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and Meta and then startups and smaller companies figuring out what is the killer app, because it feels like it's possible, like a Chat GPT type of thing. It's possible to build that, but that's 10x more compelling using already the LLMs we have, using even the open source LLMs, Llama and the different variants. So you're investing in a lot of companies and you're paying attention. Who do you think is going to win this? Do you think there'll be who's going to be the next PageRank inventor?
$1 trillion question.
Another one. We have a few of those today.
A bunch of those. So look, there's a really big question today. Sitting here today is a really big question about the big models versus the small models. That's related directly to the big question of proprietary versus open. Mm-hmm. Then there's this big question of where is the training data going to, like, are we topping out on the training data or not? And then are we going to be able to synthesize training data? And then there's a huge pile of questions around regulation, and what's actually going to be legal. And so I when we think about it, we dovetail kind of all those questions together. You can paint a picture of the world where there's 2 or 3 God models that are just at like staggering scale, and they're just better at everything. And they will be owned by a small set of companies, and they will basically achieve regulatory capture over the government, and they'll have competitive barriers that will prevent other people from, competing with them. And so, there will be, just like there's like, whatever, 3 big banks or 3 big, or by the way, 3 big search companies, or I guess 2 now. It'll centralize like that. You can paint another very different picture that says, no, actually the opposite of that's going to happen. This is going to basically, that this is the new gold, this is the new gold rush alchemy. This is the big bang for this whole new area of science and technology. And so therefore you're going to have every smart 14-year-old on the planet building open source, right? And figuring out ways to optimize these things. And then, we're just going to get like overwhelmingly better at generating training data. We're going to, bring in like blockchain networks to have like an economic incentive to generate decentralized training data and so forth and so on. And then basically we're going to live in a world of open source, and there's going to be a billion LLMs, right, of every size, scale, shape, and description. And there might be a few big ones that are like the super genius ones, but like mostly what we'll experience is open source. And that's more like a world of like what we have today with like Linux and the web.